Yeah, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Gordon Fairley, Business Development Director for Depsys, focused on Northern Europe, including UK. And we're going to talk about a key event in the UK today called Future Networks. Ramzi?
Hello, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ramzi Solomon and I'm a Technical Account Manager. I lead project delivery at Depsys, and I'm also focused on the geographical area of Northern Europe. Yeah, it was a pleasure to attend the event in the UK.
So we're going to spend 30 minutes taking you through some of the highlights of the event from our perspective. It was a very busy one day in Birmingham, UK. The event's called Future Networks, happens every year. And it's really a gathering of some of the leading experts in the UK electricity and in fact energy sector, because in the UK both electricity and gas are combined into one event. But obviously from Depsys' perspective, we're very excited to meet and hear from the leading electricity network experts in the UK. And so the event was fantastic. Insights both from the government, from the regulator, and from the distribution and transmission companies in the UK. So we're going to go through that in 30 minutes. Just to start, Ramzi, so first up on the agenda, we heard from the Energy Department in the UK with some strong insight into what's driving the government's thinking around the energy transformation and the electricity market in the UK. Maybe you could share some thoughts on that.
Yes, sure. Paul van Heiningen, who's the Deputy Director of Net Zero Electricity Networks at BEIS, he delivered the keynote address, which is titled Government's Plan for an Agile and Flexible Network Post-Net Zero Strategy. And basically, there is a very clear recognition of the urgency and the need to act to achieve net zero. Secondly, there is a recognition of the impact of some of the global events like the war in the Ukraine that is having a huge impact on the energy sector. And I think the underlying message is that the UK's response cannot be crisis-driven because it leads to an unsustainable approach, and it may delay the delivery of the promise of net zero. So extracting from Paul's presentation, I've taken some very key statistics. The first is around a publication that was made last week Friday by the EV infrastructure strategy group, setting targets and resources, one of which is setting aside 1.8 billion British pounds to actually create 300,000 EV charging stations. So that's a huge investment. And the second target is 600,000 heat pumps by 2028. So you can see that there's going to be major infrastructural changes that will take place, and hopefully that will allow the UK to actually achieve their goal. The other important thing that they want to achieve is that the power sector itself must be net zero by 2035, and they'd like to phase out combustion engines of vehicles by 2035 as well. So overall, some very big and ambitious targets, and I get the very clear sense that they are driven and motivated to actually achieve that.
Okay, thank you, Ramzi. And following the Energy Department's presentation and information that Ramzi just shared with you, I had the pleasure to listen to Steve McMahon, who was from Ofgem. And Steve had a lot of very interesting insights. And one of the themes you'll hear throughout the next 30 minutes is data, the importance of insights and data, the importance of smart systems and the adoption of smart systems as a key component, not just as a nice to have, but a very key component of the energy transition in the UK. So just again, using some of the stats, UKPN, like most countries, UK electricity demand will double, so across the UK, and by 2050, obviously we've heard from other countries like Denmark, it's expecting to double by 2030. And so the increase in electricity demand is hitting all of the sectors in all of the countries. So in addition to the challenges that the companies are facing, as we talked about the rollout of EV charging, Ramzi just mentioned, the actual electricity demand on the networks is increasing. So obviously that has a major impact. In parallel, the transition to renewables was a key theme throughout the conference. Some great work and some highlights from the transmission grid provider. Scottish and Southern highlighted, for example, that they are working very hard to put in additional links into the very remote islands of Scotland. And part of the reason they're putting in these high capacity transmission links and additional transmission links is to serve the offshore wind. And from a UK statistic, the numbers are that they're anticipating a move to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The number today is 11 gigawatts, which shows you the scope of the change that's coming. When you look at the overall transition to net zero, a major saving from a carbon perspective, in fact, up to 40% of that carbon saving comes from moving the whole energy sector over to electricity. So as Ramzi mentioned, heat pumps are a major focus, move to EV is a major focus in the UK market. And so that combined approach is very significant. Now, as well as efficiency as part of the transition is very important. There's a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of talk about the savings that can be made, and there's a number of numbers out there. The one that came from the conference was what, £4.5 billion British pounds per year by 2035 in terms of savings from smarter system. I think from Carbon Trust report from last year, they talked about 16 billion savings per year from 2050. Ofgem themselves have talked about 10 billion savings per year by 2050. Obviously very significant, and they're trying to bring that back to the consumer. One of the big things you hear about in the UK is energy equitable energy, meaning that all consumers would benefit from the energy transition and no consumers should be left behind. And that's a very key aspect of the UK market, that Ofgem puts that responsibility with the network companies and the electricity providers, and make sure that as you deploy EV, for example, that you need to move in that direction. But,
there was one thing that Steve raised, and maybe I can ask you the question, Gordon, at least from your perspective. He had actually identified that the relationship between distribution and transmission is going through its biggest change in 50 years. And I wondered if you could perhaps reflect on that, at least from a data perspective, because at least my experience in the past is that things were in silos, and now I think they're forced to consider them both, not vertically, but in a cooperative sense.
Yes, indeed. And he did, as you mentioned, the greatest transition in 50 years was one of the flagship statements. He also made a very strong statement around the collaboration that was increasing between TSO and DSO. Obviously, we've seen National Grid acquire WPD, the second largest network company in the UK. And so we're seeing that collaboration and transition. And I think that's, as you mentioned, driven by data supporting flexibility, supporting improved forecasting. And the flexibility market at the moment, while it's a lot to do with higher voltages, is coming down obviously towards DSO, and the markets are opening up. And I think, as we'll touch on later, the openness of the data and the use of data much more strategically within companies is a very key and fundamental part of the transition that's ongoing. Okay. Well, maybe on that theme, as we transition, you had the pleasure to listening to Matt Webb from Head of Enterprise Data at UKPN. You can share some insights.
I did. And this section was about the role of innovation and partnerships. And his presentation was titled Facilitating Open Data for Smart Energy Future. And UKPN had actually established a partnership through which they were able to build an open data portal. I think they had spoken about it for quite some time, but they'd used the last 12 months to actually deliver on that. They have built an open data platform, which, as you highlighted before, was a bit of a problem. There is also no uniformity across the UK about how those data sources can be accessed. And the data sources or the types of data that can be accessed through it. And to date, they have 34 data sets and more than 5,000 users of that open data platform. So some of the data types are configurable, interactive, and callable data visualizations. And the data is used by both internal and external customers to UKPN itself. What was great for me about the presentation was the effort they made to actually map out all of their stakeholders' needs into what they called a data user ecosystem. And I have two or three reflections. So while they've been through this data transformation process and focused on data principles to actually deliver it, it was unclear to me what the quality of data was and whether it actually serves any operational need, and whether the data sources were combined to give valuable insight, since not all data can be considered to be the same. The second is, for me, there remains a sort of an unanswered question as to whether the existing electrical grid data offers sufficient grid insight, especially since UKPN is so large, it's so diverse, it's got assets spread over a very wide geography. It serves also 9 million users that are all of different profiles. And then the final question that I had was, when I accessed the information, a lot of it was asset information, and that only forms one level or layer of insight. So it'd be very interesting to see how UKPN's open data platform actually evolves, but also how the UK evolves in merging all of that together. Because if I go back to what you'd mentioned about Steve McMahon, he mentioned that there is going to be something called a future system operator. And that future system operator is mandated by BEIS and Ofgem to actually bring grid data from both electricity and gas networks together. So it's going to be a massive task to actually coordinate all of those efforts. And if you don't have high quality data, it's just not going to be possible to meet the needs of your customers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Talking, so actually we talked about data, as we talked in the UK context, I think in every country, the important person, of course, is at the end of the chain in terms of consumer. Ramzi, you also joined enabling a consumer-led transition. Do you want to provide some insights to that?
So one of the nice things about this conference was it was a hybrid event. People were virtual or in remote, and others were there physically. I think most persons were there physically. And I think the organizers did a very good job of having interactive sessions. And so I participated in this roundtable session where different stakeholders from across the industry came together to give their feedback on one of three topics, and the one I attended was enabling consumer-led consumer-led transition. So the two key viewpoints, at least from my perspective, was how the consumer must be the central focus and must also participate in the direction of what is to be delivered. And I think that's powerful. And as we know now, just from looking at how the UKPN have actually mapped out their stakeholders, it's a whole variety of consumers that should be polled and that should give their views and insights as to what they need. And then secondly, a concern that was raised, and I think this is valid not just in the UK, but everywhere else in the world, just because we're all touched by the energy transition and the urgency to actually make significant progress on the topic, was the uncertainty of how to deal with the huge challenge or delays in delivery might imply that the customer bears the burden of the transition. And I think that could be seen as catastrophic. It would turn into some sort of a unsustainable situation, given, in this moment at least, the rising cost of basic commodities and also gas and electricity prices. So yeah, I thought it was a very informative session, especially because different stakeholders could give their very real and raw input.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I joined equally an interesting round table event called the Future of Transport. We talked about EV adoption. Well, not only EV, because it was a joint energy forum, but obviously major focus for Depsys and interest is in transition to EV in the UK market. I think a statistic that's really interesting, 2030, the target or the expectation is 1 in 3 cars on the road in the UK are forecast to be electric. 1 in 3 cars, that's like 8 years from now, so that's very significant. I think one of the things from going back to Ofgem briefly that they said was that this major transition, as we talked about, the biggest transition in 50 years, and that's an opportunity, which we all understand, but it also brings a lot less predictability, which having data and data insights at the core of that is going to be super fundamental to just kind of enabling and having headlights as you go into all of this uncertainty that's coming and opportunity that's coming from the transition. So I think, it was a very excellent discussion. There's a lot of debate. Obviously, a lot of households in the UK have the access to, are actually not apartment buildings. Most British people live in houses, and so they do have access to home charging. There was, though, debate about making sure that access to EV charging was equitable for everyone. So, that means very available and on-street charging and centralized charging. And I think, like many countries at the moment, one of the big dynamics is that there's a lot of companies offering services, and it's not very well coordinated at the moment. So that really seemed to be more of a coordination feature than a delivery of the electricity through the network, although we're all very aware that EV charging on the network brings a lot of not only capacity issues, but also power quality issues, as we see. Okay. So one of the things, of course, we talked about data innovation is super, also very important. We had the pleasure to listen to Jonathan Berry from WPD, Head of Innovation, taking us through Western Power Distribution WPD's activities. One of the DSOs in the UK have been funded by through Ofgem, NIA and NIC projects for a number of years. They're in the current RIIO, what's called RIIO ED1 regulatory window for transmission company. That's finished already, and they're now in ED2 for the DSOs. It's going to finish in March next year, and they're going to transition into the new regulatory window, ED2. As part of that, Ofgem have put in place something called the Strategic Innovation Fund, and that's going to bring £450 million and has some flexibility associated with it to allow it to flex up and down depending on the amount of innovation that's required. I think the whole innovation market, going back to Western Power, they talked about target of 90% of low voltage substations with enhanced monitoring installed by 2030. So there's real ambition there. I think it's incredibly important and very needed to serve the energy transition as EV and distributed energy resources, PV and heat pumps, and ultimately batteries come onto the distribution network. So a lot of really important work. Also, we had the pleasure of having Cormac Bradley present to us from Northern Ireland networks. Interesting stats from there, 49% of electricity consumed today comes from indigenous renewable resources. Target is to increase that to 80% by 2030. And they're also expecting a 30% increase in EV and heat pumps during that time frame. And again, he made the statement, they'll be monitoring key to unlocking capacity and managing asset health. So we see the importance of data and data in the network. Maybe a final note from the conference, and then we'll go on and talk a little bit about Depsys' delivery of data and working with customers on grid edge analytics insights and grid edge computing. Final comment.
We also have two questions that we should
please,
also answer.
we should go to that. Let me come to the question. 2 seconds. I just wanted to comment on going back to Steve McMahon from Ofgem. He made the statement, pace of change is phenomenal, quote unquote, which I love to hear. I mean, and you can feel the energy in the room. I mean, it was very clear that everyone's motivated to change. Clearly, though, we see the regulatory process, the tender process, I think the DSOs are eager to go quicker. I'm hoping that in the new regulatory window that we'll see that opening up, and there's a lot of collaboration to make that happen. And really, we're looking forward to seeing that pace pick up as we go forward. So, Ramzi, questions?
Yes. Should we get to the 2 questions first before we go to the sort of
yes, let's do that. Why not?
Okay. So the first question is, how clear are the UK DNOs on what they want to use the data for? And you had mentioned a few things about data earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it is clear in the sense they've actually mapped it out. I'm not too sure whether there's been a very distinct recognition of what it's going to be used for. So I think that's the very simple answer from my side. So there's a mapping out, but there is not a convergence of all of the data sources and how it is to be used. I also recognize that DSOs often don't want to centralize all the actions or can't centralize all the actions at one place because they don't have operational systems that integrate all those data sources. So I think it definitely is work in progress, and I hope that answers the first question. The second question is there any view on exchange of data planned between the grid operator and the retail provider? I wonder, Gordon, do you have any insights?
I think I'd firstly say that, again, at the conference, probably one of the groups that were not that well represented, if at all, at the conference was the energy retailers. I mean, obviously, they've been going through significant transition in the UK. At the moment, like many countries, the energy prices are, skyrocketing due to the war in Ukraine and the increase in gas prices, in part driving that dynamic, not equal in every country, but UK is also affected. Yes, I think there is sharing of information. I know that I've seen projects run from discussions at other conferences where the energy providers are, or the energy retailers are in discussions with the network companies, but clearly there's more work to be done there. I'm not aware of really how much energy information is being shared.
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of data integrators and service providers that were represented, and I think they were represented because DSOs and TSOs were attending the event. And I think with the creation of this future system operator being very critical to the sustainability of UK's energy sector, that they see this big impending challenge, and they're going to need to develop adaptive and agile systems in order to actually bring it all together. So I certainly see it as work in progress. I also see big partnerships between, like with UKPN, UKPN and ODS, the fact that maybe data specialists, but not particularly grid specialists, being utilized to actually give the insight. But then the big question is, how is it going to be used? What is the quality of that data? Is the grid operator going to be able to say something about the information that they receive? And from a retail perspective, how is that going to impact everyone? involved.
Yeah, I think just touching on the ability also of the networks to interact, one of the areas that kind of always flexibility. One of the areas is, you're using data to control, for example, charging. And one of the feedbacks clearly was that apparently historically in the UK, there was discussion at one stage a few years back about, the network operator going to control one of your assets in your house. I don't know, back then, I think it was refrigerator, and the press got hold of this, and then it was a big deal. And, it was like, the electricity company, the general public in the UK really are adverse to the network company taking control. So the incentive and the regulation and the flexibility market will be driven by choice, consumer choice, and incentive through flexibility market pricing, and not through sharing of data and control of end assets by the network company.
Yeah, I think if I could add a point there, it was recognized in one of the presentations that the lack of granularity of data and proper information is being compensated for at the moment by the development of other mechanisms like tariff adjustments and market changes. So where there is no unified focus on data or open data across the industry, and that there will be this combining of electricity and gas data, there is going to be a need for a focus on getting the right information out so that there are not compensatory mechanisms used that eventually affects the customer and the client. And I think, I mean, at least from my view, the only way to be really responsive to the needs of the customers and to effectively dealing with the urgency of the situation is going to require greater insight from more granular data, with a more sustainable or cost-effective controllable features that are deployed in a portion of the grid that is unseen, allowing obviously for faster response times to localized problems as opposed to higher voltage or higher systems based problems.
I think just making some comments as we move towards the close of the session. And clearly, Depsys was talking to customers about the importance of grid edge data acquisition, grid edge computing, and grid edge algorithms, and the insights that can be gained from that very, high quality data acquisition and algorithm and analysis. And ultimately, it's the insights from that data, the grid edge. I think in the UK context, there's something like 500,000 secondary substations. And so there's a lot of sites where some data has been gathered today, but very limited. And there's, a huge drive as we move towards through the next 8 years towards 2030, to support sort of the headlights and the insights that are needed to support the energy transition. One area we get a few to talk about, probably not enough time to do it all justice, fault management. Obviously, one of the very key things was an interruption incentive mechanism. It was part of the regulation in the UK that drives a lot of work across the UK in terms of fault management. Fault management in terms of both holistic sense, but also we're looking at fault prediction and the holistic view of fault. What was your network doing in real-time analysis when the fault took place? And obviously with the storms like Storm Arwen, Storm Eunice, there's been a big focus on outages recently in the UK, as with many countries. Ramzi, your comments? The control forecasting.
I mean, as I said before, the requirement for greater insight is obviously going to enable the faster response times to the localized problems that actually exist. And of course, the different DNOs and the different geographies, they deal with problems differently. But an interesting recommendation that was given actually from BEIS was that the DNOs need to facilitate stronger engagement with local authorities which I thought was a very strong and powerful recommendation, in the sense that with those local interactions, you could develop stronger mechanisms to actually build, develop, control, and then deliver flexible solutions based on the requirements.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ramzi. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed some of the insights Ramzi and I were able to share today. Appreciate you taking the time. And say thank you to everyone again for joining. And we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.